Please don't look at my back, she begged. But the giant cowboy did, and burst into tears. In a frozen frontier town, a frightened woman hides scars too terrible to show. A towering cowboy, feared by men but gentle at heart, takes her in. But when her shawl slips, he sees the marks of a brutal whip, the same kind he once endured himself. Now the streets whisper, the church bells toll, and the lawman who hurt her rides tall with a badge on his chest. He calls her a criminal. She carries only shame. Yet hidden in her scars is a truth powerful enough to topple him. Hooves thunder, jail keys rattle, the town holds its breath. Will a giant cowboy's tears be enough to break her chains of fear? Or will the law's iron fist bury the truth forever? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The winter wind howled through the streets of Silver Bluff, Colorado, pushing stinging snow against Mariah Carson's face as she stumbled down the wooden sidewalk. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the bitter cold, but she clutched it tight around her shoulders, her knuckles white with the effort of keeping it from slipping. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings as townsfolk hurried past, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Mariah felt their stares burning into her, heard their whispers trailing in her wake. A woman pulled her child closer as Mariah passed, eyeing her threadbare dress and mud-caked boots. "Ain't seen a kind round here before," one man muttered to another outside the saloon. "Looks like trouble," came the reply. Mariah kept her eyes down, counting each step to keep her mind off the cold and the shame of her appearance. The mercantile's windows glowed invitingly, promising warmth within. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door, making the bell above it jingle. The shopkeeper, a round-faced man with grey whiskers, looked up from his ledger. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for work, sir," Mariah said softly, her voice rough from the cold. "Any kind of work. I can keep books, cook, clean." "Ain't hiring." The shopkeeper cut her off, his eyes already back on his ledger. "Try the saloon. They're always looking for girls." Mariah's cheeks burned. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, turning quickly toward the door. Her vision blurred with unshed tears as she pushed it open, the cold air striking her face like a slap. She nearly collided with the man standing just outside. Stumbling back, Mariah found herself looking up and up at the tallest man she'd ever seen. His broad shoulders blocked out the fading light, but his face, partially hidden beneath a snow-dusted hat, held none of the judgment she'd seen in others. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Couldn't help but overhear. Name's Eli Thompson. Folks call me Big Eli." He gestured toward a building down the street. "Mrs. Potter's boarding house serves up a good hot meal. Would you allow me to buy you some supper?" Mariah's stomach clenched at the mention of food, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten. But the thought of sitting in a public place, where anyone might see— "Please!" she blurted, her voice sharp with fear. "Don't look at my back!" The words hung between them in the cold air. Eli's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He gave a slight nod, as if accepting a solemn vow. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "You have my word." The boarding house was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Mrs. Potter, a thin woman with kind eyes, showed them to a corner table without comment. The yellow lamplight cast a gentle glow as Mariah slowly ate the thick stew and crusty bread Eli had ordered. She could feel his presence across the table, solid and watchful. But true to his word, he kept his eyes on his own plate, or the window beside them. "Thank you," she murmured, when only crumbs remained. "I can't repay you." "No need," Eli replied. His large hands wrapped around his coffee cup, which looked small in his grip. "Mrs. Potter has an attic room available, if you're needing a place for the night." Mariah's throat tightened. The thought of a real bed, even in an attic, was almost too much to hope for. "I don't have enough—" "Already settled," Eli said, standing. Good night, Miss Carson. He left before she could protest, his heavy boots quiet on the wooden floor. Mrs. Potter appeared moments later with a key and directions to the attic room. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed tucked under the sloping ceiling. Mariah sat on the edge of the thin mattress, her shawl still clutched tight, and let the tears finally fall. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, her prayer barely audible. "Please keep me safe here." Downstairs in the boarding house's common room, Eli Thompson sat in a worn armchair near the dying fire. Her words echoed in his mind. "Don't look at my back." Such simple words, but the desperation in them had struck him like a physical blow. He knew that tone, knew it from his own past, from nights spent hiding from his father's rage. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Eli watched them fade, his thoughts on the young woman trembling in the attic above. Whatever marked her back, whatever brought her to Silver Bluff on this winter night, he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in his own mirror, years ago, when he'd finally gathered the courage to run. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of Mrs. Potter's boarding house as Mariah made her way downstairs. Her steps were unsteady, but determination lined her face. The smell of coffee and fresh biscuits from the kitchen made her stomach clench painfully. Mrs. Potter emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Child, you look pale as milk. Come sit and have some breakfast." "I cannot accept more charity," Mariah said softly, adjusting her shawl. "I need to find work." "At least take a biscuit for—" But Mariah had already slipped out the front door into the biting cold. The morning sun did little to warm the streets of Silver Bluff. Fresh snow from the night before crunched under Mariah's worn boots as she made her way down the wooden boardwalk. Her breath came out in white puffs, and her fingers trembled as she pulled her thin shawl tighter. She had passed 3 establishments when the world began to tilt. The buildings seemed to swim before her eyes, their edges blurring like watercolors. Her legs felt strange, disconnected. The last thing she saw was the approaching boardwalk as darkness claimed her vision. Eli Thompson had just stepped out of the feed store when he heard the commotion. Through the gathering crowd, he saw a crumpled form in a familiar shawl. His heart lurched. "Stand back!" His voice boomed across the street as he pushed through the onlookers. Mariah lay motionless on the snow-dusted boards, her face as white as the frost around her. Without hesitation, Eli scooped her up in his arms. She felt light as a child, too light. Her head lolled against his chest as he cradled her carefully. "Get Doc Matthews," he ordered a wide-eyed boy who stood gawking. The child scampered off as Eli strode toward the boarding house, his long legs eating up the distance. Mrs. Potter was already holding the door open, her face pinched with worry. "Bring her into the parlor," she directed, hurrying ahead to clear the sofa. Eli laid Mariah down as gently as if she were made of spun glass. Her shawl had come loose in the carry, and as he tried to arrange it more comfortably, he froze. Through the gap in her worn dress, he saw them. Scars. Dozens of them, crisscrossing her back like a terrible map. Whip marks, deep and old, the kind that came from repeated cruelty. The kind that never fully healed. The room spun. Eli staggered back, his massive frame hitting the wall with a thud. His legs gave way, and he slid down to sit heavily on the floor. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks as memories crashed over him like a wave. The crack of his father's belt, the burning shame, the helpless rage of a child who couldn't understand why. His own scars, hidden beneath his shirt, seemed to burn anew. A small sound drew his attention back to the present. Mariah's eyes had opened, and the terror in them when she saw him crying pierced his heart like a knife. She tried to scramble up, to pull her shawl tight, but weakness made her movements clumsy. "No, please," she whimpered. "Please don't." Eli fell to his knees beside the sofa, keeping his distance but needing her to understand. "Miss Carson," he choked out through his tears, "I swear on my mother's grave, I mean you no harm. I know." His voice broke. I know because I carry the same marks. Mariah went still, her eyes wide and searching his face. You ... My father, Eli managed, wiping roughly at his cheeks. I was 12 the first time, 16 when I finally ran. Understanding dawned in her expression, followed by something like wonder. She relaxed slightly against the cushions, though her hands still clutched her shawl. Mrs. Potter appeared with blankets and hot tea, her movements efficient but gentle. Doctor's on his way, she said, tucking a blanket around Mariah. Though what you need most is rest and regular meals. Eli stood, his legs steadier now. I'll pay for her room and board, Mrs. Potter, as long as she needs. That's not necessary, Mariah protested weakly. Please, Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. Let me help. Not out of pity, out of understanding. Mariah's eyes filled with tears, but she gave a tiny nod. The doctor came and went, confirming what they already knew: exhaustion and malnutrition. He left powders for sleep and instructions for small, frequent meals. As darkness fell outside the boarding house windows, Eli sat in a chair beside Mariah's bed. She had been moved to a ground-floor room, no longer hidden away in the attic. The lamplight cast soft shadows on the wall as she drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Each time she stirred, her hand would clutch at her shawl, and her eyes would search the room until they found him. Each time, he would nod slightly, a silent promise of protection, and she would relax back into slumber. Eli's own back ached from the straight-backed chair, but he didn't move. He had known from the moment he saw her in the mercantile that something in her called to the broken places in his own soul. Now he understood why. The night deepened, and still he kept his vigil. Outside, snow began to fall again, but in this room, for the first time in longer than either could remember, they weren't alone with their scars. The winter sun had climbed to its peak when Eli knocked softly on Mariah's door. She opened it cautiously, already dressed and wrapped in her shawl despite the warmth of the boarding house. Miss Carson, he said, his voice gentle as always. This town's got more eyes than sense, and tongues faster than telegraph wires. I reckon you'd heal better somewhere quieter. Mariah glanced toward the window, where curious faces had been appearing all morning. She nodded slowly. Where? I've got a line shack about 4 miles out. It ain't much, but it's peaceful. He shifted his weight, boots creaking. If you're willing to trust me that far. She studied his face. The same open, honest expression she'd seen by lamplight during his vigil. I trust you, she said quietly, surprising them both. Within the hour, Eli had borrowed Mr. Wilson's wagon and loaded it with supplies from the mercantile. He helped Mariah up onto the seat, careful not to touch her back, then covered her legs with a heavy blanket. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently in the traces. They left town slowly, the wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. The sounds of Silver Bluff, its whispers and stares, faded behind them. Around them stretched white plains broken by scattered pine groves, all beneath a pearl-gray sky. The silence between them felt easier than either expected. After a while, Mariah spoke softly. Thank you. For last night, and this. Eli nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail. Ain't right, being alone with memories like that. How long? She asked, then added quickly. After you ran, I mean. 12 years now. He adjusted his grip on the reins. Found work on the Carter spread, learned to wrangle. Been moving between ranches since. Mariah pulled the blanket tighter. Does it ever stop hurting? Gets different, he said carefully, like an old brake that aches before storms, but you learn to carry it. She absorbed this, watching their breath mist in the cold air. Eli didn't press her for her own story. Some wounds needed time before they could be spoken aloud. The line shack appeared as they crested a gentle rise, a simple cabin of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a lean-to shelter held firewood and tools. Eli helped Mariah down from the wagon, then led her to the door. It ain't much. he repeated, almost apologetically. But Mariah's eyes took in the solid walls, the sturdy door with its iron latch, the window with actual glass. "It's perfect," she whispered. Inside, Eli showed her around the single room. A potbelly stove squatted in one corner, already radiating heat from the fire he'd built earlier. A narrow bunk with a straw tick mattress lined one wall, covered with wool blankets. Rough shelves held basic provisions: flour, coffee, salt pork. A table with two mismatched chairs stood beneath the window. "The pump's just outside," he explained. "Water's sweet, comes from a deep spring. Never freezes." Mariah ran her hand along the smooth-worn table edge. "You live here alone?" "Most times. Ranch hands use it during roundup, but that's months away." He began unloading supplies from the wagon. Potatoes, beans, dried apples, more blankets. As afternoon settled into evening, Mariah insisted on cooking. She moved carefully around the small space, adding ingredients to the pot hanging over the fire. The familiar motions seemed to steady her. Eli sat at the table, acutely aware of another presence in his usually solitary domain. The cabin filled with the smell of simmering stew and the soft sounds of someone else's movements. It stirred something in his chest, an ache he hadn't known was there. When the stew was ready, Mariah filled 2 tin bowls. It was thin fare, mostly beans and potatoes with a little salt pork for flavor, but Eli ate as if it were a feast. "Been a long time since I had proper cooking," he said quietly. "Much obliged." Mariah ducked her head at the praise, but he caught the ghost of a smile. Night drew in early, as it did in winter. Eli lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. The wind had picked up, making the cabin's timbers creak. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus. Mariah tensed at the sound, her hand instinctively clutching her shawl. Eli rose from his chair, his massive frame blocking most of the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was low and fierce with conviction. "Miss Carson, Mariah, I need you to hear something." She looked up at him, waiting. "Nobody will hurt you again," he said solemnly. "Not while I breathe. That's my promise to you." Tears welled in Mariah's eyes, but she didn't look away. She saw the truth of it in his face, in the way his hands shook slightly as he made his vow. This giant of a man, who carried scars like her own, was offering her something she'd almost forgotten existed: safety. "I believe you," she whispered. Outside, the coyotes called to each other across the snowy plains. But inside the line shack, in the circle of lamplight, 2 wounded souls had found a fragment of peace. It was fragile as a bird's egg, this trust between them, but it was real. Eli added wood to the stove for the night, then took his leave to sleep in the lean-to where he'd arranged a bed of straw. Mariah barred the door behind him, not out of fear, but habit. Through the window, she watched his shadow move in the moonlight, settling in to keep his protective vigil. For the first time in years, she lay down to sleep without terror clutching at her throat. The coyote's song continued, wild and lonely, but it no longer seemed like a threat. Instead, it was just another voice in the night, singing over their small sanctuary of healing. Morning sunlight streamed through the line shack's window, casting warm squares on the rough wooden floor. Mariah moved through the quiet cabin with newfound ease, her soft humming mixing with the whisper of her broom against the floorboards. The simple task of sweeping brought a peace she hadn't known in months. Eli watched her from the doorway, reluctant to break this moment of contentment. "I need to ride into town for supplies," he said finally. "Will you be all right here alone?" Mariah paused her sweeping, gripping the broom handle tighter. "Yes," she answered, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'll keep the door barred." "I'll be back before dusk." He adjusted his coat, checking that his pistol rode easy in its holster. "There's coffee hot on the stove." The ride into Silver Bluff took longer than usual. Fresh snow had drifted across the trail, and Eli's mind kept wandering back to the line shack, to Mariah's quiet presence there. The town emerged from the white landscape like a woodcut picture, Stark buildings against the pale sky. At the general store, Eli noticed the change immediately. Conversations died as he entered. Eyes darted away from his questioning gaze. He approached the counter where Mr. Wilson, the shopkeeper, suddenly became very interested in his ledger. "Need flour," Eli said quietly. "Coffee too, and some dried beef if you've got it." Wilson nodded without looking up. "Sheriff's been asking after a fugitive woman," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Says she escaped custody. Debtor's prison." Eli's hand stilled on the counter. "That so? Dark hair, small build, probably wearing a shawl." Wilson finally met his eyes. "Sound familiar?" Before Eli could respond, the store's door swung open with a bang. Sheriff Henry Dalton filled the doorframe, his badge catching the winter light. Eli's blood ran cold. 20 years had passed, but he'd never forget that face, his mother's brother, the man who'd made his childhood a living hell. "Well, well," Dalton drawled, boots striking hard against the floor as he approached. "If it ain't my sister's boy, still running from family, Eli?" The store fell silent as a tomb. Eli straightened to his full height, towering over his uncle. "Ain't running from nothing." "No?" Dalton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you won't mind telling me if you've seen a young woman passing through. Pretty little thing, answers to Mariah Carson. She's wanted for escaping lawful custody." "Haven't seen her?" The lie felt bitter on Eli's tongue. Dalton stepped closer, close enough that Eli could smell whiskey on his breath. "Blood ties mean something in these parts, boy. Or did you forget that when you ran off?" His voice dropped lower. "Law's on my side. Your protection means nothing against that." "Law ain't always justice," Eli replied, each word measured carefully. "Justice." Dalton laughed, an ugly sound. "You sound just like your fool mother. Look where that got her." He turned to leave, then paused. "I'm searching every ranch and line shack in the county. When I find that girl, and I will find her, anyone helping her will swing." The threat hung in the air long after Dalton left. Wilson quietly packed Eli's supplies, adding extra coffee without charging for it. No one met Eli's eyes as he loaded his saddlebags and mounted up. The ride back seemed endless. Snow began falling again, thick flakes that obscured the horizon. Eli's mind raced with memories he'd tried to bury, the sound of his mother crying, the crack of his uncle's belt, the day he finally ran. Now Dalton's shadow had found him again, threatening not just him but Mariah, too. Dusk was gathering when he reached the line shack. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the window. Mariah opened the door at his knock, relief clear on her face. "Something's wrong," she said immediately, reading his expression. Eli stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. "Sheriff's looking for you. Says you escaped custody." Mariah sank into a chair, her face gone pale as paper. "He found me," she whispered. "Oh, God, he found me." "Mariah." Eli knelt beside her chair, making himself smaller despite his size. "I need to know what happened. Why's he after you?" She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling. 3 years ago, I kept books for my father's ranch. Sheriff Dalton was using his position to steal cattle from Apache herds, selling them through legitimate ranches. I found the proof in the numbers. Her voice caught. When I threatened to expose him, he had my father arrested on false charges, took our ranch as payment for imaginary debts. Tears rolled down her cheeks now. He said he'd kill my father if I didn't stay quiet. Then he took me to his office and... Her hands clutched her shawl. The whip was just the beginning. He kept me locked up, said I was in debtor's prison to work off my father's crimes. I escaped last month when a deputy forgot to lock the cell. Eli's hands had curled into fists. "Dalton's my uncle," he said roughly. "My mother's brother. He hurt us too when I was young. Made me watch while he beat her. Said it was teaching me respect for the law." Mariah stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why you cried," she whispered, "when you saw my back." Eli nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's walls. Their sanctuary suddenly felt as fragile as a soap bubble, ready to burst at the slightest touch. "What are we going to do?" Mariah asked, her voice small against the growing storm. Eli rose slowly, every movement heavy with the weight of their shared past and uncertain future. "First we eat," he said firmly. "Then we plan. He ain't taking anyone else from me. Not ever again." They sat close to the stove that night, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Neither spoke much, but their silence held a new understanding. They were bound now by more than just shared pain. They were bound by a common enemy, and the desperate need to stop him before he could hurt anyone else. The wind continued to howl outside, and somewhere in the darkness, Sheriff Dalton was already planning his next move. But in the line shack's warmth, two wounded souls drew strength from each other, preparing to face whatever morning might bring. The line shack settled into a gentle rhythm as January deepened. Each morning, Mariah rose before dawn to kindle the stove, her movements growing more confident in the small space she now shared with Eli. The crackle of fresh kindling and the soft whisper of coffee brewing became their quiet greeting to each day. Eli would stomp snow from his boots after feeding the horses, bringing with him the crisp scent of winter air. "Smells mighty fine in here," he'd say, as Mariah worked cornmeal into batter. She'd learned he liked his cornbread dark and crusty, baked in the cast-iron skillet his mother had once used. The days unfolded slow and peaceful. Eli spent mornings chopping wood, the steady thunk of his axe echoing across the snow-covered meadow. Mariah would watch from the window sometimes, marveling at how such a big man could move with such grace. The woodpile grew taller than she was, a fortress against the cold. "Got to teach you to ride proper," Eli announced one clear morning, leading his gentle mare Sugar from the barn. "Can't have you stuck here if trouble comes." Mariah approached the horse cautiously. "I rode some, before everything changed. Sugar here's steady as they come." Eli patted the mare's neck. "She'll take good care of you." He helped her mount, his huge hands gentle at her waist. The saddle creaked as she settled in, gripping the reins tight. Sugar stood patient, steam rising from her nostrils in the cold air. "That's it," Eli encouraged. "Just let her walk. Feel how she moves." They spent the afternoon circling the snowy meadow, Mariah gradually relaxing into the rhythm of Sugar's gait. Eli walked alongside, one hand resting on the mare's shoulder. When Mariah finally smiled, really smiled, he felt something warm bloom in his chest. Each evening they shared simple suppers of beans and cornbread, sometimes with wild game Eli trapped. The lantern cast soft shadows as they ate, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. After clearing the dishes, they'd sit by the stove while Eli read from his mother's old Bible. "Would you pray with me?" he asked one night, voice hesitant. Mariah twisted her hands in her lap. I haven't prayed in a long time. Not since—" She touched her back unconsciously. "The Lord ain't turned his back on you," Eli said softly, "even if others have." She nodded slowly, and they bowed their heads together. Eli's deep voice filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort, while Mariah's lips moved silently, testing the shape of prayers she'd thought forgotten. Yet peace remained fragile as spring glass. Every distant hoofbeat made Mariah freeze, her eyes darting to the window. Eli noticed how she'd shrink into herself at such moments, as if trying to disappear. One afternoon, returning from town with supplies, Eli's face was darker than usual. "Folk are talking," he said, hanging up his coat. "About me keeping a woman here." Mariah's hands stilled in the dough she was kneading. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that ain't kind." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Dalton's deputy's been riding circuit too, checking every cabin and homestead in the county." That evening, as they sat with bowls of bean soup, Eli cleared his throat. "Been thinking." he said carefully. Maybe you could stay on here. Proper like. He stared into his bowl. I know it ain't much, but oh, Eli. Mariah's eyes filled with tears, spilling down her cheeks. You don't know what it means hearing you say that. But Dalton, she shuddered. His reach is too long. He won't stop until he finds me. We could leave, Eli offered. Head west, maybe. Start fresh. But they both knew running meant leaving behind everything Eli had built here, his small herd, his mother's cabin, the life he'd carved out of wilderness. And even then, would Dalton's shadows ever stop following them? Mariah reached across the table, touching Eli's rough hand with her smaller one. You've given me something I thought was lost forever, she whispered. You've shown me what safety feels like again. They sat in silence as the stove ticked softly, each lost in thoughts of what might have been, and what still might come. Outside, the winter wind keened around the cabin's corners, while inside, their temporary haven held them close, if only for a little while longer. The lamplight flickered across their faces. The giant, gentle cowboy and the wounded young woman who had somehow found each other in the vast Colorado wilderness. For now, they had this moment, this peace, this fragile warmth against the gathering storm. The Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing Silver Bluff in pristine white. Eli Thompson stood at the line shack's door, adjusting his freshly pressed shirt collar while he waited for Mariah. You sure about this? Mariah's voice trembled slightly as she emerged from behind the curtain that divided their living space. She had borrowed one of Eli's old shirts, carefully taken in and transformed into a simple but proper blouse. Her skirt, though worn, had been brushed meticulously clean. Folks need to see you as you are, Eli said softly. A good woman trying her best. Besides, he added with a gentle smile, the good Lord welcomes everyone. Mariah wrapped herself tightly in her shawl, making sure every scar remained hidden. The wagon ride into town was quiet, broken only by the steady crunch of wheels through snow and the occasional snort from the horses. As they approached the white-painted church, Mariah's fingers gripped her shawl tighter. Ladies in their Sunday finest clustered near the entrance, their conversations falling to whispers as Eli helped Mariah down from the wagon. Did you hear? One woman murmured behind her gloved hand. Living alone with him in that shack. Scandalous, another replied, just loud enough to be heard. Eli placed his large hand protectively at Mariah's elbow, guiding her forward. His towering presence seemed to dare anyone to speak directly against her, yet the whispers followed them like shadows. Inside the church, lamplight gleamed on polished wooden pews. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, stood greeting parishioners. Her smile froze when she saw Mariah. Well, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice sharp as winter wind, we welcome all souls here, even the fallen ones. She turned away quickly, but her words struck Mariah like physical blows. Eli's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply leading Mariah to a pew near the back. She sat rigidly, feeling dozens of eyes upon her. Women pulled their children closer as they passed. Men cast sidelong glances, then looked away. The service began, filled with familiar hymns that Mariah had once loved. Now each word seemed to mock her. She stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, willing herself not to cry. As the congregation filed out afterward, an elderly Apache woman approached them. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes held warmth and wisdom. I am Nightshade, she said simply, her accent gentle. I help bring babies into this world, and I have seen much suffering. She took Mariah's cold hands in her weathered ones. Some scars show on the skin, others hide deeper. Both need healing. Mariah's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. Thank you, she whispered. Outside, several men clustered near the hitching post where Eli's wagon waited. Their voices carried clearly in the crisp air. Lost your senses, Thompson, one called out. Harboring that kind of woman? Ain't proper. Another added, "Man your size ought to know better." Eli drew himself up to his full height, shoulders squared against their judgment. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but firm. "Best mind your own business, gentlemen." The men fell silent, though their disapproving looks spoke volumes. Eli helped Mariah into the wagon, tucking blankets around her against the cold. The ride home was heavy with unspoken pain. Only when they were safely inside the line shack did Mariah's control finally break. She sank into a chair by the stove, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I've brought shame to you too now." Eli knelt beside her chair, his huge frame making the gesture awkward but sincere. "They don't know you," he said firmly. "I do. You're a good woman, Mariah Carson. Don't let their poison touch your heart." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "How can you be so sure?" "You hardly know me." "I know enough." He stood, moving to stoke the fire. "I know you pray every night, even when you think I can't hear. I know you never waste a scrap of food. I know you're gentle with sugar and kind to the wild creatures that come asking for scraps." He turned to face her. "Those things tell me all I need to know about your heart." Mariah sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing his words. Then she noticed a tear in the sleeve of his Sunday shirt, probably caught on a nail while helping her down from the wagon. "Let me fix that for you," she said softly, reaching for her sewing basket. It was a small thing, but it was something she could do, some tiny way to belong. Eli handed over the shirt without comment, settling into his chair with a book while she worked. The cabin filled with comfortable silence, broken only by the crack of the fire and the whisper of thread through fabric. Her neat stitches slowly closed the tear, each one a quiet declaration. She might not belong in Silver Bluff's church, but here, in this humble line shack with this gentle giant of a man, she had found something like home. As evening settled over the Colorado wilderness, Mariah finished the last stitch and held up the mended shirt. The repair was nearly invisible, a small victory against the day's wounds. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the wagon tracks that led to town, as if trying to erase the morning's pain. The late winter morning dawned bright and clear as Mariah studied their dwindling flour supply. She twisted her hands in her apron, knowing they couldn't stretch it another day. "I need to go to town," she announced quietly. Eli looked up sharply from mending his bridle. "I can ride in later." "No." Mariah straightened her shoulders. "I can't hide forever. It's broad daylight, and Sheriff Dalton will be busy at the courthouse on Thursdays." She'd learned his patterns, like a mouse studying a cat's habits. Eli's weathered face creased with worry. "At least let me—" "Please." She met his concerned gaze. "I need to do this." He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Take Sugar," he said, referring to his gentle mare. "She knows the way home if—" He didn't finish the thought. The ride into Silver Bluff was tense, but uneventful. Mariah kept her head high despite the sideways glances from townsfolk. At the general store, she hurried through her purchase, coins clutched tight in her palm. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, a familiar voice called out softly, "Child, come share some tea." Mariah turned to find Naich, the Apache midwife, standing in the doorway of a modest home just off the main street. The older woman's kind eyes drew her in like a beacon. "I shouldn't—" Mariah glanced nervously down the street. "The sheriff is deep in his cups at the saloon," Naich said matter-of-factly. "Come, some things need speaking." Inside, Naich's home was spare but welcoming. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with sage and sweetgrass. A kettle already steamed on the small stove. "Sit." Naich gestured to a wooden chair. "Your shoulders carry too much weight." Mariah perched uncertainly while Naich poured tea into 2 tin cups. The aromatic steam curled between them like a bridge. "I have seen many wounded by Henry Dalton's greed," Naich said quietly, settling into her own chair. He takes what is not his, using law like a weapon. Mariah's hands trembled around her cup. You know about. I know he builds his power on others' pain. Nietzsche's dark eyes grew distant. Years ago, my people had good grazing land, many cattle, fair agreements with settlers. She sighed. Then Dalton became sheriff. Suddenly papers disappeared. Treaties meant nothing. Our cattle were seized for unpaid taxes we never owed. I'm so sorry, Mariah whispered. It is an old wound now. Nietzsche studied her over the rim of her cup. But you carry fresh ones. Mariah's hand went instinctively to her shawl-covered back. I can't. Listen carefully, child. Nietzsche leaned forward. Your scars are not shame. They are proof. Truth is stronger than silence. But who would believe? Those who need to will believe. Others? Nietzsche shrugged. Their blindness is their burden, not yours. Tears spilled down Mariah's cheeks. I'm afraid, she admitted. All the time. Fear is natural, but fear can trap truth in darkness where evil grows stronger. Nietzsche pressed something into Mariah's palm, a small leather pouch. Healing herbs. For the skin, yes, but also for the spirit. Remember, you are stronger than you know. The ride back to the line shack passed in a blur, Nietzsche's words echoing in Mariah's mind. As she approached, she saw Eli pacing the yard, his big frame rigid with worry. Thank God, he breathed when she dismounted. I feared. Dalton didn't see me, she assured him quickly. I met Nietzsche again. Inside, as Mariah set down her purchases, she repeated the midwife's words. She said my scars could be proof, not shame. That truth is stronger than silence. Eli stood very still by the stove, his broad shoulders tense. She's right, he said roughly. Then, with slow deliberation, he unbuttoned his shirt collar. What are you? Truth for truth, he said quietly, turning his back to her. He slipped the shirt down just enough to reveal faint silvery ridges crossing his shoulder blades. My father's belt, every Saturday night after drinking. Mariah's breath caught. Tentatively, she reached out to touch one pale scar, feeling Eli's muscles tense, then relax under her fingers. How did you survive it? Same as you. One day at a time. He turned to face her, eyes bright with unshed tears. Keeping silent didn't protect me. Won't protect you either. They stood together in the warm lamplight, two wounded souls finding strength in shared pain. Outside, the winter wind moaned around the cabin's corners, but inside, something fragile and new took root. The first seedling of hope, watered by tears and truth. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Inside the line shack, Mariah stood before the clouded mirror, fingers trembling as she wove her dark hair into a neat braid. The new shawl Eli had given her lay across the bed, soft blue wool that reminded her of summer skies. You sure about this? Eli's deep voice carried from the main room where he waited, already dressed in his Sunday best. Mariah touched the cross at her throat, a quiet reminder of strength. Yes, she answered, surprising herself with her steadiness. After what Nietzsche said, maybe it's time to stand tall. She emerged from the bedroom, and Eli's breath caught. The blue shawl brought color to her cheeks, and her braid hung like a rope of dark silk down her back. Something sparked in his eyes, pride mixed with something softer. You look, he cleared his throat. Real nice. The wagon ride to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the white-painted church, Mariah's fingers tightened on Eli's arm. But she lifted her chin, remembering Nietzsche's words about truth being stronger than shame. They climbed the steps together, his arm steady beneath her grip. The usual whispers followed them in, but this time Mariah noticed something different. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, gave a small nod. Old Mr. Jenkins actually touched his hat brim. They settled into a back pew just as the first hymn began. Mariah's voice wavered on the opening notes of Amazing Grace. Barely a whisper. But Eli's deep baritone rose beside her, strong and sure, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Gradually her voice steadied, growing stronger. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar words felt different now, more real somehow. By the second verse, she was singing clear and true, her voice blending with the congregation. Reverend Miller's sermon spoke of redemption and second chances. Mariah felt certain eyes on her during those passages, but for once she didn't shrink away. Eli's solid presence beside her gave her courage. When the service ended, she braced herself for the usual rush to avoid her. Instead, Mrs. Peterson approached with a tentative smile. "That was lovely singing," the baker's wife said softly. "We could use another voice in the choir." Mariah blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you, Ma'am." Others followed, not many, but enough. Old Mr. Jenkins mentioned the weather. The Cooper sisters smiled shyly. Each small gesture felt like a precious gift. Outside, snow had begun falling again, fat flakes drifting lazy circles in the still air. Eli helped Mariah into the wagon, tucking blankets around her with gentle care. "Proud of you," he murmured as they started home. "Real proud." Mariah ducked her head, cheeks warming despite the cold. It felt different today. Like maybe there's hope after all. "There's always hope," Eli said firmly. "Sometimes it just takes folks a while to see clear." Back at the line shack, they settled into their evening routine. Eli built up the fire while Mariah brewed coffee. The familiar domestic sounds, crackling wood, bubbling pot, spoons clinking against cups, filled the cabin with comfort. They sat together in the lamplight, steam rising from their cups. Mariah couldn't stop touching the blue shawl, marveling at its softness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the shawl. For everything." Eli's smile was shy, almost boyish despite his size. "Suits you. Blue was my mama's favorite color." "Was?" Mariah asked gently. "She passed when I was young, before ... He trailed off, but Mariah understood. Before the beatings, before the pain that had driven him from home. They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee and watching snow fall past the window. The lamp cast a warm glow over everything, softening edges, creating a bubble of peace. Mariah found herself humming one of the hymns from service, her voice clear and unafraid in the quiet cabin. Eli joined in, his deep bass harmonizing naturally with her higher notes. The music wrapped around them like an invisible blanket, a shield against the darkness beyond their walls. "Think I might go to choir practice," Mariah said when the song ended. "If Mrs. Peterson meant what she said." She did. Eli's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Folks are starting to see the real you." "The real me?" Mariah's hand strayed to her back, where the scars lay hidden. "Strong. Kind." Eli's voice was gruff with emotion. "Beautiful inside and out." Their eyes met across the lamplight, and something shifted in the air between them. Mariah's heart fluttered like a wild thing. Eli's hands tightened on his coffee cup. The moment stretched, delicate as a soap bubble. Then Mariah smiled, small but real, and Eli's answering grin lit his whole face. Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing the world in pristine white, while inside, two hearts beat a little faster in the warm lamplight. The next Sunday dawned grey and threatening, with heavy clouds hanging low over Silver Bluff. Mariah stood before the mirror in the line shack, pinning her blue shawl just so, unaware this would be the last peaceful moment of her day. Her fingers traced the soft wool, remembering last week's small victories, the kind smiles, the invitation to join the choir. "Ready?" Eli called from outside, where he waited with the wagon. "Coming," she answered, giving her reflection one final glance. The ride to town was quiet, snow starting to swirl in the bitter wind. Eli kept glancing at Mariah, noting how she sat straighter now, less hunched against the world. The sight made his heart ache with pride, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. They arrived at the church just as the bells began to toll. Inside, the wooden pews gleamed in lamplight, and the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth. Mrs. Peterson smiled and gestured for them to join the choir section. Mariah's steps were light as she followed Eli to their place. The opening hymn filled the church, voices rising in harmony. Mariah's clear tones soared with the others, her eyes bright with joy. For one shining moment, everything felt right. Then the doors burst open with a crash that shattered the peace. Sheriff Dalton stood in the doorway, snow swirling around his tall frame. 2 deputies flanked him, hands on their gun belts. The singing died away to shocked silence. "Pardon the interruption, Reverend." Dalton's voice dripped false courtesy as he strode down the aisle, boots echoing on wooden floors. He pulled a paper from his coat. "But I've got a writ here for a fugitive from justice." Mariah went rigid beside Eli, her face draining of color. Eli started to rise, but strong hands grabbed his shoulders. Mr. Jenkins and young Tom Cooper, their faces pained but determined. "Don't," Tom whispered. "You'll just make it worse." Dalton reached the choir section, that paper held high like a weapon. "Mariah Carson," he announced, voice ringing through the stunned church. "You're under arrest for fleeing debtor's custody and theft." "No," Mariah whispered, shrinking back. "Please." But Dalton's hand shot out, fingers digging into her arm. "Been lying to these good folks, haven't you?" He yanked her forward. "Playing at being respectable when you're nothing but a thief and a runaway?" "That's not true!" Eli's roar shook the rafters. He struggled against the hands holding him, but more men moved to help restrain him. They knew opposing the sheriff meant jail. Or worse. Dalton dragged Mariah down the aisle, her feet stumbling on the wooden floors. Her eyes darted wildly, seeking help, but congregation members turned away, unwilling to meet her desperate gaze. "She's innocent!" Eli's voice broke. "You're the thief, Dalton. You're the—" "One more word," Dalton cut in, "and you'll join her in jail, nephew." He spat the last word like poison. Outside, the snow was falling harder, wind whipping it into stinging sheets. Dalton shoved Mariah forward, and she stumbled, falling hard in the muddy slush. Her blue shawl slipped from her shoulders as she tried to catch herself. Gasps rippled through the crowd that had followed. In the grey light, Mariah's scars stood stark against her pale skin, the lattice of old whip marks impossible to miss. Women covered their mouths, men looked away, even the children fell silent. Dalton smiled, cold and satisfied. "See what kind of woman you've been harboring?" He grabbed Mariah's arm again, hauling her up. "These are the marks of justice on a criminal." "No!" Eli's bellow carried over the wind as he finally broke free, charging down the church steps. But Dalton's deputies had their guns drawn now, and the sight stopped him cold. "That's right," Dalton sneered. "The law's the law, Big Eli. Even for giants like you." He thrust Mariah toward his deputies. "Get her to the jail." They dragged her away through the swirling snow, her blue shawl lying forgotten in the mud. Eli stood helpless, fists clenched, watching until they disappeared around the corner. The townspeople began to drift away, murmuring amongst themselves, leaving him alone in the storm. Hours later, darkness had fallen over Silver Bluff. In the town jail, Mariah huddled in a corner of her cell, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her dress was still damp from the mud, and without her shawl, the cold seeped into her bones. Outside her cell, Eli gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white. "I'll get you out," he promised, voice rough with fury and grief. "I swear it, Mariah. I'll find a way." But the only answer was the hollow echo of his words in the empty jail and the sound of Mariah's quiet weeping. Beyond the barred windows, snow continued to fall, covering the town in a blank white sheet that hid all traces of the morning's cruelty. Dawn broke cold and brittle over Silver Bluff, the rising sun casting long shadows across untouched snow. Eli Thompson walked the outskirts of town, his heavy boots crunching through fresh drifts. His breath came out in white clouds, matching the storm inside his heart. The weight of his revolver pressed against his hip with each step, whispering dark promises. His fingers brushed the worn grip, remembering how quick and final a bullet could be. The image of Dalton falling played in his mind. Justice served hot and fast, the way of the frontier. Eli's massive frame cast a giant's shadow as he paused at the edge of town, staring at the jail where Mariah spent the night. His hand tightened on his gun belt. One shot. That's all it would take to end Dalton's tyranny, to answer humiliation with lead. "The gun's an easy answer, son," a quiet voice said behind him. "But it's never the right one." Eli turned to find Reverend Matthews standing there, his black coat dusted with snow. The preacher's kind eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "What else is there?" Eli's voice came out rough, scraped raw by helpless fury. "He destroyed her, made them all see her scars, made them think—" His words choked off. "Come walk with me," the preacher said softly. They moved away from town, following the curve of the creek where bare willows bent under their white burden. Neither spoke for a long while, letting the crunch of snow fill the silence. "I've known Henry Dalton 20 years, Reverend Matthews finally said. "Watched him twist the law to serve himself. Seen good people broken by his greed." He paused, brushing snow from a fence rail. "But I've never seen him truly afraid until now." Eli stopped walking. "Afraid? Of what?" "Of truth, son. Of what that girl knows. Of what you might remember." The preacher turned to face him. "Why do you think he was so quick to shame her in public? To remind everyone he holds the law?" The big man's shoulders slumped. "Doesn't matter now. Nobody will stand against him. Not after yesterday." Eli's voice cracked. "I couldn't protect her. I promised, and I failed." "You're wrong there." Reverend Matthews stepped closer. "Violence would have failed her. Getting yourself killed or jailed, that's no protection. But the truth—" He tapped Eli's chest. "Truth is stronger than bullets, braver too." Tears spilled down Eli's weathered cheeks, freezing in his beard. "I don't know how to fight this way, Reverend. All I know is working cattle and using my fists when I have to." "Then learn. Find courage in faith, not fury." The preacher's voice grew stern. "That girl needs your strength now more than ever, but strength to stand and speak, not to shoot and die." Eli wiped his face with a rough hand, nodding slowly. The gun at his hip felt heavier now, more burden than comfort. "I need to see her," he said. "Go. But remember, hope doesn't come from hate." Reverend Matthews squeezed his arm. "It comes from believing justice is possible even when the path seems dark." Inside the jail, morning light filtered weakly through barred windows, doing little to warm the cold stone walls. Mariah knelt in her cell, hands clasped in prayer, tears tracking silently down her face. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know if you can hear me anymore. Everything feels so dark." Her shoulders shook. "Nobody will believe me now. They all think—" She couldn't finish. Heavy footsteps in the corridor made her scramble back from the bars, but it was Eli's familiar bulk that appeared, not Dalton's threatening swagger. She rushed forward again, reaching through the iron bars. "Eli," she breathed, clutching his offered hands. "I've lost everything. All hope of anyone believing me about what he did. About the cattle he stole from Nightsh's people. About all of it." "Not hope." Eli's voice was fierce but gentle. "Not while I breathe." He pressed his forehead against the bars, close to hers. "We'll fight him, but not with guns. With truth." "Truth?" She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "What do you mean?" "The preacher helped me see. Dalton fears what we know. Your testimony about the stolen cattle. My memories of his cruelty." Eli's grip tightened on her hands. "He tried to shame you into silence yesterday." But maybe, his voice grew stronger, maybe those scars aren't shame at all. Maybe they're proof. Fresh tears welled in Mariah's eyes, but something else flickered there too, a spark of the same realization Naicha had tried to share. Proof, she repeated softly. Evidence of his real nature. Yes. Eli pressed her cold fingers between his warm ones. I promise you this, we'll find a way to make the truth known, not with violence, but with courage. I'm scared, she admitted, leaning against the bars again. Me too, he said simply. But we're not alone. God sees, and he ain't finished writing this story yet. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands linked through iron bars, sharing warmth and whispered prayers in the cold morning light. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the fresh snow bit by bit, revealing the solid ground beneath. Twilight settled over the line shack like a purple blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that made the wooden walls creak. Eli sat alone by the pot-belly stove, stoking the flames and trying not to think of Mariah shivering in her jail cell. The sudden knock at his door made him start. He opened it cautiously, finding Naicha's weathered face in the gathering darkness. Snow dusted her black shawl, and her dark eyes held urgency. May I enter? She asked quietly. What I carry must not be seen by others. Eli stepped back, ushering her inside. The Apache woman moved with deliberate grace to the stove, warming her hands before reaching into the folds of her shawl. She withdrew a leather pouch, handling it like it held something precious. I have kept this hidden many years, Naicha said, her voice low but clear, waiting for the right time, the right people. She looked up at Eli. I believe that time is now. From the pouch, she pulled out a folded document, its edges worn soft with age. The paper crackled as she carefully spread it on Eli's small table, smoothing it with gentle fingers. This is a cattle lease, she explained, signed 15 years ago between my people and the settlers. It proves the grazing rights were paid for, the agreements honored. Her finger traced a line of faded ink. Until Sheriff Dalton seized our herds, claiming we had no right to them. Eli leaned closer, squinting at the cramped handwriting. But this show's different. Yes, Naicha nodded. And here, she pointed to a signature at the bottom. This witness, it is Mariah Carson's father. Eli's breath caught. Her father? He kept records for the Indian agent then. He saw everything, how Dalton forged new papers, how he threatened those who might speak against him. Naicha's voice grew heavy with memory. When her father died in that accident, Mariah inherited his knowledge. She was just a girl, but she knew. Understanding dawned on Eli's face like a sunrise. That's why Dalton whipped her, not for debts at all, to silence her. Naicha finished, to make her afraid to speak of what she knew. She straightened, drawing her shawl closer. But scars can speak louder than words if we let them. They become proof of evil done in darkness. Eli's massive hands trembled as he touched the document. This could ruin him. Truth often ruins those who build lives on lies. Naicha's eyes were kind but firm. The question is, do you have courage to bring it to light? To stand with her against him? I'd die for her, Eli said roughly. Better to live for her, Naicha countered, to stand beside her while she finds her voice again. She pressed the document into his hands. Keep this safe tonight. Tomorrow, show her. Let her choose if she is ready to speak. After Naicha left, Eli sat long hours by the dying fire, reading and rereading the lease. Each word seemed to burn with purpose, with possibility. He thought of Mariah's scars, how she'd hidden them in shame, but they weren't shame at all. They were testimony, written in flesh, of one man's corruption. Sleep eluded him. As soon as dawn's first grey light touched the eastern sky, he saddled his horse and rode hard for town. The jail was quiet, most prisoners still sleeping. Mariah sat awake in her cell, wrapped in the thin blanket they'd given her. Eli? She whispered, seeing his shadowed form approach. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, he said, voice urgent but gentle. Something's right, finally right. He pulled the document from inside his coat, holding it where she could see through the bars. Look at this, really look. Mariah took it with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she read, then filled with tears. This is Papa's writing. I'd know it anywhere. Her fingers traced the signature. He told me about this lease before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should remember the truth about Dalton and the Apache cattle. That's why Dalton hurt you, Eli said softly. To keep you quiet about this. She nodded, tears falling freely now. I was so scared, so ashamed. I thought the scars meant I was ruined, marked forever as someone who deserved punishment. No. Eli reached through the bars, taking her hand. Those scars are proof of his crimes, not yours. They're evidence of what he did, to you and to Nightshaw's people. Mariah's breath hitched. You want me to testify? To show everyone? Only if you choose to, Eli said. But Mariah, think on it. Your scars tell the truth he tried to hide. They're not your shame. They're his. She stared at the document for a long moment, then lifted her chin. Though fear still shadowed her eyes, something stronger shone there too. I'll do it, she whispered. I'll speak the truth, whatever it costs. Eli knelt beside her cell, and she knelt too, their hands clasped through the iron bars. Without speaking, they bowed their heads in prayer, asking for strength to face what lay ahead. Lord, Eli murmured, help us stand firm in truth. Give us courage to face the light, and wisdom to use it well. Mariah added softly. The morning sun crept through the jail window, touching their joined hands with golden light. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake a tiny witness to their quiet resolution. The morning after finding the document, Eli rode out before dawn, his breath frosting in the cold air. His first stop was Miller's farm on the outskirts of Silver Bluff. The old farmer stood in his doorway, squinting against the pale sunrise. Reckon it's time someone stood up to him, Miller said quietly, after Eli explained his purpose. He twisted his worn hat in his hands. Dalton's been squeezing us dry with his special taxes for years. Took half my wheat crop last fall, claimed it was for back taxes I never owed. Would you say so in public? Eli asked. Tell folks what he did. Miller's weathered face hardened. I'll speak truth. Been waiting too long to do it. Throughout that first day, Eli visited more farms and homesteads. At each stop, he heard similar stories. Widow Sarah Jenkins wiped tears as she described how Dalton had seized her wagon, claiming her late husband owed gambling debts that didn't exist. The McPherson brothers told of cattle mysteriously disappearing after they'd refused to pay Dalton's protection fees. By sunset, 6 families had agreed to speak, but Eli knew they needed more. The second day brought him to Tom Burke's blacksmith shop. The smith's mighty arms were covered in soot as he hammered at his forge, the ring of metal on metal echoing through the cold air. Dalton threatened to burn my shop down, Burke said, setting his hammer aside. Said he'd claim it was an accident if I didn't give him free work. His dark eyes met Eli's. Count me in. I'll tell what I know. Word spread quietly through town. More people came forward, a seamstress who'd lost her shop, a freight driver forced to pay double rates, even the previous deputy who'd quit rather than follow Dalton's corrupt orders. Each one carried a piece of the truth, like fragments of a broken mirror finally being pieced together. Meanwhile, Mariah waited in her cell, finding strength in ancient words of faith. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she recited, Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. The familiar psalms became her armor, wrapping around her like a warm blanket against the cold stone walls. When Eli visited, he found her kneeling in prayer. We have witnesses, he told her softly through the bars. Brave folks willing to stand with us. She looked up, her face pale but determined. I'm ready, she said. The truth needs telling, no matter how it hurts. On the morning of the third day, the town hall filled quickly. Word had spread of a special meeting called by the town council. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk. Whispers rustled like dry leaves as people speculated about the purpose. Sheriff Dalton arrived late, deliberately casual in his movements. He stood at the front of the hall, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His badge caught the light from the high windows, flashing like a warning. "Well now," he drawled, addressing the crowd, "I hear some folks have complaints about how I keep the peace in this town." His hand rested meaningfully on his pistol. "I'm all ears." The hall fell silent. People looked down at their hands, suddenly unsure. Fear had been Dalton's weapon for so long they'd forgotten how to fight it. Then the double doors at the back swung open. Eli entered first, his massive frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Mariah, wrapped in a clean shawl that covered her from neck to waist. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had expected to see her out of jail, much less here. She walked with her head high, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. More people filed in behind them, Miller, Burke, Widow Jenkins, and all the others who had promised to speak. They filled the back of the hall, a solid wall of witnesses. Dalton's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning, harder and colder. "Well, if it ain't my soft-hearted nephew," he sneered. "Come to make a fool of yourself over some worthless—" "That's enough," Eli cut him off, his deep voice filling the hall. "These good people have gathered to hear truth today. Truth you've tried to bury with threats and violence." "Truth?" Dalton laughed, but there was an edge to it. "You're addled, boy. Always were too simple to understand how things work. Simple enough to know right from wrong." Eli answered steadily. He turned to address the crowd. "Folks, you know me. I'm not one for speeches. But today you'll hear stories, true stories, about how this man has abused his badge and the trust we placed in him." Mariah stepped forward, her voice clear, though quiet. "You'll hear my story too," she said, "about why he really put these scars on my back." The hall erupted in murmurs. Dalton's face darkened like a thundercloud. "Now see here." But Miller stood up from his bench. "We'll hear them out," the old farmer declared. "Time for truth to have its say." Other voices joined in agreement. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, like the first trickle that eventually becomes a flood. Dalton glared at the gathered witnesses, at Mariah's straight spine, at Eli's steady gaze. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. He was no longer facing one scared girl or a single reluctant nephew. He faced a community finally ready to speak. "Fools!" he spat. "All of you! You think your words can touch me? I am the law in this town." "No," Eli said quietly. "The law serves truth, and truth serves justice." He placed a gentle hand on Mariah's shoulder. "That's what we're here to prove." The morning sun streamed through the high windows, touching each face in the hall. It fell on Mariah's shawl, on the witnesses' determined expressions, on Dalton's increasingly uncertain sneer. Like truth itself, the light could not be turned back. The time for testimony had come. The packed town hall grew quiet as Eli Thompson stepped forward. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight streaming through the high windows. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the wooden floorboards as he faced the assembled townsfolk. "Before we hear from others," Eli said, his deep voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I need to show you something." He began unbuttoning his shirt. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Dalton sneered. "What kind of show you putting on, boy?" Eli didn't answer. Instead, he turned his broad back to the crowd and let his shirt fall. Gasps filled the hall. Pale scars crisscrossed his skin, old wounds that had healed but never faded. "My father, Dalton's brother, gave me these," Eli said quietly. "Made the belt whistle through the air just like his brother does. Cruelty runs in their blood. He pulled his shirt back on, facing Dalton. "But it stops here." The sheriff's face had gone red. "You always were weak, crying over a few welts." "No," Eli answered. "The weak ones are those who hurt others to feel strong." He turned to Mariah. "You ready?" She nodded, though her hands shook as they gripped her shawl. The wooden floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked to the front of the hall. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "My name is Mariah Carson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger. "And I bear witness to Sheriff Dalton's true nature." She turned her back to the crowd and slowly lowered her shawl. The collective intake of breath seemed to pull all the air from the room. Her back, exposed to the morning light, told its own story of cruelty. Deep welts, worse than Eli's, formed a brutal tapestry across her skin. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered. A woman began to cry softly. "He did this," Mariah said, her voice shaking but clear, "because I knew the truth about his theft, because I saw the papers that proved it." Nightja rose from her bench, her dignified presence drawing all eyes. In her weathered hands, she held up a yellowed document. "This lease," she announced, "shows how Dalton stole cattle from my people." Mariah's father witnessed the true ownership. That is why Dalton sought to silence her. "Lies!" Dalton shouted, but his voice cracked. "You can't prove—" "I can prove it," Old Farmer Miller interrupted, standing. "Those same cattle appeared in Dalton's herd the next spring. He claimed he bought them fair, but we all knew better." His gnarled hands clenched into fists. "Just like we knew better when he started charging us extra taxes that never made it to the county books." More voices joined in, a dam of silence finally breaking. Tom Burke the blacksmith told of threats to his livelihood. Widow Jenkins described her stolen wagon. One by one, farmers stood to testify about seized crops and mysterious fees. Dalton's face grew darker with each revelation. His hand crept toward his gun, but a dozen men shifted forward, making their own intentions clear. He wouldn't leave this hall armed. "You're all ingrates," he snarled. "I kept order here. Without me, Without you, we'd have justice." Mariah cut in. She had pulled her shawl back up, but stood straight now, no longer hiding. "These scars aren't my shame anymore, Sheriff. They're your judgment." A roar of agreement filled the hall. Men surged forward, reaching for Dalton's badge. The sheriff backpedaled, looking wildly around for supporters and finding none. His heel caught on a floorboard, and he stumbled. "Stay back!" he shouted, but his authority had evaporated like morning dew. The badge was torn from his chest. His gun belt followed. As hands grabbed for his arms, he wrenched away and fled through the side door, leaving behind the power he had abused for so long. In the sudden quiet, Mariah stood in the shaft of sunlight, her head held high for the first time since she'd arrived in Silver Bluff. Tears streaked her cheeks, but they were tears of relief, not shame. She looked at the faces around her, faces that now showed respect instead of judgment, compassion instead of fear. Eli moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and protective as always. But now she didn't need to hide behind his strength. Her scars had become her testimony, and that testimony had brought truth to light at last. The town council quickly convened in the corner, already discussing arrangements for a proper investigation and a new sheriff. But for Mariah, standing in that bright morning light with her head finally held high, justice had already been served. Her wounds had spoken their truth, and that truth had set her free. The winter sun had already dipped behind the mountains as Eli Thompson guided his wagon along the snowy track toward the line shack. Beside him, Mariah Carson sat wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. The events in the town hall had left them both drained but lighter somehow, as if a great weight had lifted from their shoulders. "Town council says they'll have papers drawn up by week's end," Eli said, his deep voice gentle in the gathering dusk. "Making sure you get fair compensation for what Dalton put you through." Mariah nodded, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. It still doesn't feel real, she whispered. All those years of carrying that secret, those scars, and now everyone knows. And they stood with you, Eli reminded her. Even old Miller, who never takes anyone's side. A smile tugged at his mouth. Reckon that's something worth remembering. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as they approached the little shack. Soft flakes had begun falling again, dusting Mariah's hair with white. The simple cabin looked different somehow, more like home than hiding place now. Eli helped her down from the wagon, his massive hands gentle at her waist. Best get inside before this snow picks up, he said. I'll see to the horses. While Eli led the team to the stable, Mariah climbed the familiar steps to the cabin door. The rough-hewn boards creaked beneath her feet, a sound that had become oddly comforting over these past weeks. Inside, darkness pressed close until she found the matches and touched flame to the lamp wick. Warm light spilled across the cabin's sparse furnishings, the potbelly stove, the wooden table with its two mismatched chairs, the narrow bunk with its patchwork quilt. Simple things that had come to mean safety and peace. When Eli returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found her still standing in the middle of the room, lost in thought. He moved to light a second lamp, his big frame casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Mariah," he asked softly, noting how she hugged herself, shoulders tight. She turned to him, and in the lamplight he saw tears shining in her eyes. "Please," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Please don't look at my back." The same words she'd spoken that first night in town, but different now somehow. Then they'd been born of terror and shame. Now they held something else, a plea for him to see beyond the scars to who she truly was. Eli crossed the room in 2 long strides. His weathered hands engulfed hers, warm and steady. "I'll look at your heart instead," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. A tear slipped down Mariah's cheek as she raised her eyes to his. The gentle giant who had protected her, who had shown his own scars to help her stand strong, now looked at her with such tenderness it made her breath catch. He smiled then, that rare, sweet smile that transformed his entire face. "Come on inside proper," he said. "Let's get some supper started." Together they moved around the familiar space, falling into their evening routine. Mariah stirred up cornbread batter while Eli built up the fire in the stove. Soon the cabin filled with warmth and the homey smell of baking bread. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, but its silence felt peaceful now rather than threatening. The storm that had driven Mariah to Silver Bluff had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and new. Over their simple supper of cornbread and beans, they spoke quietly of the day's events. Of Dalton fleeing town with nothing but shame to show for his years of power. Of the townsfolk who had stepped forward to support them one by one. Of Naicha's quiet strength as she presented the evidence that brought truth to light. "Reckon we both carried those scars like chains for too long," Eli said thoughtfully, breaking his cornbread into careful pieces. "Hiding them, letting them hold us back from living proper." Mariah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. But today they became something else. Like bridges, maybe. Helping others see the truth, helping us connect with folks who'd been hurt too. "Bridges," Eli repeated softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I like that way of thinking on it." The lamp flame flickered, casting warm light across their joined hands. Outside, the storm began to ease, clouds parting to reveal a sky brilliant with stars. The hush that followed felt like a blessing, like the quiet after a prayer. They sat together in that peace, no longer 2 wounded souls hiding from the world, but partners who had chosen love over fear, dignity over shame. Their scars remained, but they had been transformed. From marks of pain to proof of survival, from symbols of shame to badges of courage. In the gentle lamplight of their shared home, They had found not just safety, but belonging, not just healing, but hope. And in the quiet of their hearts, they knew this was just the beginning. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.